Hi, I'm Jeff Wimmer from Studio Cycles and StudioCycles.com, and in this YouTube session we're going to talk about how to correctly use a crank removal tool. In front of me I have two separate types of crank removal tools, a spindle from a bottom bracket and a crank from the drive side of Star Trek Spinner NXT. And there are quite a few reasons why you need to remove a crank from a bicycle. Let's say the pedal has been stripped because someone cross-threaded the pedal in the crank arm. The crank arm is no longer good and you have to replace the crank arm. Or the bottom bracket, which is the bearing assembly inside the bike that the crank arms rotate on, the bottom bracket's worn out, or the bottom bracket spindle has become fractured. The crank arm's attached to the spindle, and then the spindle runs through the frame and it rolls on a bearing on each side of the frame. Every bike has a bottom bracket, whether it's a kid's bicycle, a $10,000 road bike from the Tour de France, or a commercial indoor group cycle. And crank arms on a lot of bikes, they use old technology where the spindle is tapered, it's square and it's tapered, and the crank fits onto the end of the spindle, and then there's a bolt that comes through this side. You tighten the bolt and it presses the crank onto the spindle. So when it's time to do something inside the bike that requires removing the crank, you need to use a tool to press the crank off of the bottom bracket spindle. And Park is a bicycle tool company. Most bicycle shops will use Park tools. Most of the Park tools have blue plastic coating. They're commercial grade tools. The black Park tool is made specifically for new technology bottom brackets that use what's called isospline technology, and the spindles is a different configuration or size, so you have to use a specific tool for isospline technology, and that's typically a black tool. But probably the most important part of using a crank tool is that before you can take the crank off of the spindle, you have to remove the bolt from inside the crank. There's usually a dust cover, and that comes out either with the tip of a razor blade or a screwdriver they twist out. You take the dust cover off, you take the crank bolt out, and then you're going to have the crank and the exposed spindle inside. And probably the most important dynamic to using a crank tool is making sure that the crank tool is screwed into the crank as far as possible. And typically what happens with a lot of people using crank tools is they'll only screw the crank tool into the crank arm a few turns, and then as they go to press the crank off of the spindle, what they actually end up doing is that they'll force the tool out of the crank arm, and it'll pull the threads out from the crank arm, and then you're screwed, because then you can't get your tool back into the crank arm to do the function that you started out to do. So again, probably the most important part of using a crank tool is making sure that the tool is screwed into the crank arm as far as it can possibly be screwed into. And a lot of times with these cranks, especially if it's an older bike, a bike that's been in play for a few months or even years, is the area that you screw the tool in will be corroded with rust. And you'll want to clean these threads with a wire brush like a wire toothbrush, and you just clean the threads really well. And then it's a really good idea to put a thin film of grease inside the thread barrel of the crank, and even put a thin film of grease on the tool, and make sure that the tool is screwing in straight into the crank arm. And you can turn it as far as you can if you can get it started with your fingers, and then you may need to use a crescent wrench or an adjustable wrench to turn this thing in before you start using the tool, because this tool will, as you tighten it, it will press the crank arm. There's a small nub inside of it that will push through the hole, and it will actually push the crank arm off of the spindle, and that's what happens when you tighten the crank arm inside of this area of the crank arm tool here. But again, The most important part of using this tool in my experience is to make sure that the tool is completely threaded inside the crank arm before you attempt to press the crank arm off of the bottom bracket spindle. We have a huge tech support video library at studiocycles.com. Studio Cycles is plural with an S and all one word. We also have a free bike buyer aid video at studiocycles.com for commercial customers and residential customers. Again, that's studiocycles.com.